In Chicago, progressive candidate Brandon Johnson defeated Paul Vallis in the runoff election to become mayor of that Midwestern city. Johnson was born in Chicago as one of 10 children who his mother and father raised on a working man's wages, and he would eventually become a teacher in that city, starting his career teaching in Cabrini Green, a project which became infamous for crime and poverty. Cabrini Green became a nationwide shorthand to reference poor, crime-ridden neighborhoods in the late 70s and 80s. It was also, as a little bit of a trivia side note, the location for the home in the TV show Good Times. That doesn't directly tie in here, I just thought it was interesting. In an interview from 2022 with Jacobin magazine, Johnson said this about his time at Cabrini Green. Quote, "I started to develop my politics while teaching in Chicago, particularly in Cabrini. I began to really see the stratification in not just our public education system, but our city as a whole." End quote. Johnson would spend about 10 years as a teacher and as an organizer for the union, the Chicago Teachers Union, one of the more militant of the big city teachers unions, before moving into politics. So, I mean, up to here, this is sort of a normal story, right? Like, working class kid makes good, rises to the top, etc. But I think there's a lot more here that's interesting, both with Johnson himself and also his entire situation. Let's start with Chicago itself and its recent past. I don't want to go back too far, as this isn't what this podcast is about, but we need to swing by the 80s real quick and then the recent past. The 80s were Reaganomics. These were the ideas that left families like Johnson's unable to fully get by on working class wages. He has talked about having his electricity turned off and his water turned off as a youngster, and the experience of having to rely on his neighbor's help via extension cords to keep the basics like the refrigerator running, as an example. These neoliberal, conservative-style policies are one of the primary causes of the sort of systemic failures that plagued and plague so many cities. I guess we should just call it what it was, urban austerity. And we actually have a whole episode on austerity, which everyone should check out, but basically it's just a policy of screw the poor. You know, not to put too fine a point on it, I guess. So let's jump into the 2010s now and talk about Rahm Emanuel's time as mayor of Chicago. And I promise this will tie into Johnson's election here in a minute, but I think we really want to understand this part. Emanuel was elected in 2011 and quickly started accelerating his austerity-based political initiatives. We're just going to focus on some school stuff here because it most directly ties itself to the candidacy and platform of a former teacher. Mayor Emanuel closed, with a single swing of his neoliberal blade, 50 Chicago schools, the most that had ever been closed at one single time, ever, anywhere in the country. Almost all of them, by the way, were in African American neighborhoods. His attack dog on this mission was named Barbara Byrd Bennett, a woman who would later be sent to prison due to a corruption scandal. By the way, Byrd Bennett was herself replacing one of Emanuel's closest friends, Forrest Claypool, who had also been forced to resign due to scandals related to the school board and finances. And I'll talk about him in just a minute. Emanuel claimed improved graduation rates during his campaign for re-election. It was partially true. There was some improvement, but the numbers he gave were purposefully juiced by ignoring dropouts and counting GEDs as diplomas. Once he won re-election, the numbers were revised and lowered. He also ran on a better balancing of the overall budget, which is also true, to a point. But this also came with a scandal. Forrest Claypool, CEO of the Chicago school system, who I mentioned just a moment ago, he had cut things from the educational budget like special education, which is against federal law. So closed schools in black neighborhoods, lied about graduation rates, and cut the special ed budget in violation of law and basic humanity. not to mention all the people who were charged, arrested, and forced to resign due to financial scandals. The school system also began opening tons of charter schools, which I hope we all know is terrible. And we might have to do an episode on that soon, actually. Oh, and he also crapped his pants on the response to the Chicago Pigs murdering Laquan McDonald. Wonderful former member of Obama's cabinet, isn't he? This, dear listeners, is the environment that Brandon Johnson saw his politics form in, and the ashes from which he would rise. And okay, I guess a phoenix analogy there might be a little bit much, but I'm happy this guy got elected. And it wasn't just Johnson who came up here. The ground was laid and fertilized by the Chicago Teachers Union, like I said, one of the more democratic and more radical across the whole of the United States. One thing that the union has done, really the core thing I guess, is develop something like a big tent that helps lend voices to the community and even other labor groups and unions. It's almost like a rock in the sea that these smaller organizations can cling to for stability. An anchor, I guess, a magnet maybe. I don't know what metaphor to use here if that's not obvious by now, but basically they're like a point of strength, a base, I guess. And the point that I'm trying and struggling to get at here is that through democracy and militancy, the Chicago Teachers Union has created real strength and moral character that like extends beyond its own walls. The Chicago Teachers Union has become a shining example of what a militant, democratic, and committed organized public labor sector is capable of doing, actually shaping and altering the political landscape on a citywide level. And we might laugh at that a little bit, but I don't think it's really a joke, at least in my opinion. This actually matters, and it's something that I think we can learn from, and we need to put some more focus on. I do think that we should pause here for a second, since we're talking about the CTU, and talk about Karen Lewis, who was the former head of the teachers union, who was elected to that position in 2011. She was the heart and soul of the union's return to grassroots organizing, its return to a more radical stance, its democracy, and its favoring of more militant struggles. She led the union to a victorious strike in 2012, a strike which radically shaped the lives of teachers all across the city for the better. Lewis presided over the union for less than 4 years, which makes what she and the rest of her union comrades accomplished all the more impressive. She was forced to step away due to health issues, and she would succumb to brain cancer shortly after leaving office. But her legacy lives on due to her aggressive organizing and her establishing the militant and oppositional stance of the entire union. It's almost impossible to convey just how much she meant to the Chicago teachers who had been mired with a flaccid, sometimes corrupt, and always concessionary leadership for so long. Lewis brought with her morals, ethics, and probably most important of all, an actual backbone and actual convictions. And here stands Brandon Johnson. Sorry for all the exposition to get here. Maybe it was too much. I sometimes feel like I go into the background and too much. And trust me, there's way more here in my notes than I'm trying my hardest not to ignore. So, Johnson. The man ran on raising taxes on the rich via progressive taxation rather than the ridiculous flat tax that has existed up to this point. He talked about funding schools and creating housing which is actually affordable in the city. His platform also included things like funding mental health care, healthcare more broadly, and even reducing public transit fees. Also included were alternatives to policing, like sending mental health workers to certain calls, and stuff like that, rather than armed cops. A more community-based policing. He didn't run on defund, but rather fund other things. And to do all this, he proposed the progressive taxes I mentioned a moment ago, and taxing corporations and the ultra-wealthy more. What a novel concept, right? Much like how the teachers union reinvigorated, grassroots organizing, so did Johnson's campaign. They hit the streets aggressively, talked to voters, and presented those voters with a platform which they could support, a platform which makes sense. And I don't want to spend too much time here talking about his defeated opponent, Paul Vallas, but let's hit some lowlights here just for the record. He started the charter school run in Chicago, for one, and his platform for mayor was based heavily on unfettered support of the police. And I mean unfettered literally, as he repeatedly promised to, quote-unquote, take the handcuffs off of the police. An absurd notion to begin with. And listen, if you're looking at a political candidate and you see that they are involved in charter schools, then they suck. They just suck. They're terrible. That is a 100% correlation. And worst of all, the Chicago Fraternal Order of Police heavily endorsed Vallas and led the despicable president of that group to warn that there would be blood in the streets if Vallas lost. Vallas has also courted the far right and supports Trump quite vocally. He is also fully on board with anti-LGBTQ legislation and anti-CRT rhetoric. He's just a really garbage human being, if I'm being honest with you, and Chicago should be incredibly happy that he and his bigoted austerity politics lost. Johnson himself has a lot of work to do. The city voted him in. They believed him at least a lot more than they believed in, the malignant Vallas. But he needs to deliver. The last mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, she entered office with a progressive agenda on her lips and a whole mess of votes in her pockets. And then she utterly failed to live up to anything she said, and she lost the city of Chicago, and thereby opened the door for Johnson to have a chance, and he took it. Brandon Johnson, loudly progressive union man, has won the mayorship of the third largest city in the United States. He won the battle, but the war rages on. The opposition contains the police, the military of the city, and entrenched corporate and private wealth interests, not to mention political powers of the city. These people and entities will openly and vigorously oppose every single thing that Johnson tries to do as mayor. They will lobby, beg, steal, and corrupt everywhere that they can to serve their goals. And this, I hope, can be a wake-up call to Chicagoans and other folks all across the country. The Chicago Teachers Union showed some of what's possible with determination, guts, and actual politics and militancy. In fact, one of the more touching parts of Johnson's victory party was this from David Gates. Quote, "You don't have a Brandon Johnson without a Karen Lewis. She transformed the political debate in our city. She showed Chicagoans how to stand up and demand what their schools and their city need and deserve. Tonight affirms Karen's dream of a city that works for us all, not just a privileged few." End quote. Now it is up to the Chicago Teachers Union, the strength and base of this movement, and all of the ancillary community groups, organizers, unions, and yes, even the common working class of the city, to continue to push hard and fight for and with Johnson if he is to successfully implement any of his projects. And they can do it too. The union has been the support of the movements that defeated ultra-democrat neoliberal scumbag Rahm Emanuel and even Lori Lightfoot in the primary for this very election. Johnson can't be left to fight alone to get these things done because he will lose. And if he is abandoned, those failures will not be his fault. This is a team game, and the people need to outnumber the entrenched power of the city by 1,000 to 1. It can be done, but it will require a fight. In Brandon Johnson, I believe that Chicago has a mayor who will lead that fight and who actually believes the things he is saying. Now he just has to prove it, but he doesn't really have to prove it to me, a guy out in Massachusetts. He needs to prove it to his constituents and the Chicago Teachers Union-backed movement, which helped him get to where he is. He needs to prove it to the working class of Chicago, and they, in turn, must prove themselves to him as well. And yes, I'm setting aside my pretty impressive amount of cynicism here. Please don't make me look like a fool, Mr. Johnson. I have a pretty good track record here in this podcast. I don't need to take an L on this one.